There are stories that history simply swallows, not because they're too small to be remembered, but because they're far too dangerous to survive. Somewhere in the low country of South Carolina, on a plantation that doesn't appear on any official map anymore, there was a man who sat at his master's table every single evening for nearly 11 years. He ate off the same china. He drank from the same crystal glasses. He was waited on by the very same hands that served the white family sitting all around him. And here's the thing, not one single person, not the overseer, not any of the neighbors, not the ministers who came to visit, not even the county sheriff ever said a word about it. Not one. For decades, everyone who knew about this arrangement simply refused to talk about it. The few written records that even mentioned it were somehow removed from the county courthouse back around 1879 during a fire that locals to this day argue wasn't completely an accident. All that survived were fragments. A letter tucked away here, a single line in a ledger there, one deposition buried so deep inside a probate dispute that nobody thought to look at it for over 60 years. When those fragments were finally pieced together, what they revealed wasn't some heartwarming story about kindness. It wasn't a story about redemption either. It was something far more disturbing than any of that. It was a story about calculation, the kind so precise, so patient, and so quietly devastating that it still doesn't fit any easy explanation. Before we go any further with the story of Harlan Voss and the man who sat at his table, if this is your first time on this channel, welcome. And if you've been here before, you already know exactly what kind of place the Fear Sermon is. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Click the notification bell and drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Because this story, I promise you right now, is one you are not going to forget. Let's travel back now to the beginning, to the Carolina Low Country in the year 1847, to a place they called Grayfield Plantation. The parish of St. Helena over in Beaufort District, South Carolina, sat right at the edge of the world the way most Americans understood it back in the mid-1800s. It was this place of incredible, almost violent beauty. You had these long, flat stretches of marsh grass that would turn pure gold when the autumn light hit them just right. Rivers ran the color of strong tea, dark and slow. Live oaks hung so heavy with Spanish moss they looked like they were slowly pulling themselves back down into the earth. The air always smelled like salt and mud and something even older. Something there aren't really words for in English, but something every person who lived there, white or black, free or enslaved, knew the instant they came back after being away anywhere else. That was the smell of the Low Country, and it meant you were home, whether you wanted to be or not. Grayfield Plantation covered about 900 acres, most of it planted with Sea Island cotton, the long staple kind that got the highest prices down in Charleston, and then from there all the way to Liverpool and Manchester. Sea Island cotton wasn't like the regular short staple cotton. They grew further inland. This crop needed almost surgical attention at every single stage, from picking just the right seed to timing the harvest perfectly to that delicate ginning process that had to be done slow and by hand, so you didn't damage those long fibers. What that really meant was this was a crop that demanded skilled labor, people who knew what they were doing, people with experience who understood the work. The man who owned Grayfield in 1847 was named Harlan Voss. He was 43 that year, a second-generation planter whose daddy had come down from Virginia with a decent inheritance and a huge hunger for land. Harlan had inherited both the land and that hunger, and over 20 years, he'd pushed Grayfield from its original 400 acres to almost twice that size, buying up neighboring pieces whenever their owners went broke or died without leaving any heirs. He wasn't what you'd call a cruel man in any dramatic sense. He didn't get pleasure out of watching people suffer, didn't drink himself into violent rages, didn't make a big show of his authority. By the standards of his time and place, people considered him reasonable, practical, the kind of man who understood that a plantation ran on efficiency, and efficiency needed a certain kind of order. His wife Margaret was 38, daughter of a rice planter from up in Georgetown. She was quiet, not exactly cold but definitely contained, the sort of person who only showed strong feelings when she was completely alone, if she showed them at all. She'd given Harlan 3 children. There was Thomas, their son, who was 17 in 1847 and already being trained to take over the plantation one day. A daughter named Clara, who was 14 and getting her education at home from a string of tutors brought down from Charleston. And a younger son named William, who was 9 and still mostly being raised by the household staff. Speaking of that household staff, Grayfield had about 14 enslaved people working inside the main house or in the immediate domestic areas, doing the cooking and cleaning and laundry, tending the gardens, driving the carriages, looking after the children. Out beyond them, there were somewhere between 80 and 100 enslaved people working the fields, the cotton house, the stables, and all the various outbuildings that kept the plantation running. The exact number went up and down, like it did on most plantations this size, because of births and deaths and sales and the occasional hiring out arrangement with nearby properties. Now among all these people, there was one man whose position at Grayfield just didn't fit any category the plantation system had ever created to keep people in their place. His name was Cato. He didn't have a last name, at least not one anybody at Grayfield ever used. He was just Cato, had been since the day he first arrived at the plantation as a boy, maybe 12 or 13 years old, bought at a Charleston auction house back in the spring of 1832. Nobody really knew where he came from before that. The auction records just listed him as part of a lot sold by the estate of some dead planter over in Colleton District. But those estate records were incomplete themselves, and the trail just went cold right there. What people did know about Cato by the time our story really gets going was this. He was probably 27 or 28. He was tall, real tall for that time, well over 6 feet, with a lean, angular build and hands that looked almost too big for the rest of him. The kind of hands that belonged to somebody who'd spent years doing careful, demanding work. He had a face people remembered without ever being able to say exactly why. Not what you'd call handsome, nothing striking about it really, but there was this quality of stillness, this way of paying attention that made you feel when he looked at you like he was seeing way more than you ever meant to show. For the past several years, he'd been the head driver at Grayfield, the enslaved man responsible for supervising the field hands, keeping up the pace and quality of the cotton harvest, and acting as the main go-between for the enslaved community and the white overseer. That overseer was a man named Denton Frick, who'd held the job for 6 years, and who pretty much everyone agreed was way less competent at his work than the man who was technically beneath him. This wasn't unusual on big plantations across the low country. The head driver was the one who actually understood how everything worked, who knew which fields were ready to pick and which needed another week, who knew which workers you could count on and which needed watching, who understood the rhythms and the weather and the soil in ways no white overseer, just arrived from somewhere else, could ever hope to match. The driver was essential, and being essential in the plantation economy meant having a certain kind of power. It was limited power, constrained power, power that was always conditional, but it was real power. Cato had understood this since he was very young. What nobody at Greyfield fully understood, yet was exactly what Cato had been doing with that understanding for the better part of 10 years. The whole arrangement started, as best anyone could later figure out, in the fall of 1847. That year's cotton harvest had been something special. The long summer rains had come at exactly the right times. The sea winds had stayed gentle all through August, and the bolls had opened up full and white across every single field at Greyfield. By the time the picking was finished, and the cotton had been ginned and baled and shipped down to Charleston, Harlan Voss was looking at profits bigger than anything he'd seen in the previous 5 years put together. He was a wealthy man that autumn, wealthier than he'd been in years, and his mood was what the household described. In that careful way people learn to read their master's temperament like a weather forecast, as expansive. It was in this expansive mood that Harlan Voss did something nobody at Greyfield had ever witnessed before. He invited Cato to have dinner with him. Not in the kitchen somewhere, not out in the overseer's quarters, but at the main table. Right there in the dining room of the big house, with the family silver all laid out, and the candles burning, and the household staff moving quietly around the edges of the room, with that practiced invisibility you learn when you work in domestic service. Thomas Voss delivered the invitation. He was 17, and you could tell the whole thing made him uncomfortable in ways he couldn't quite put into words. He walked over to the cotton house where Cato was finishing up the last of the season's accounting. Long columns of numbers in a ledger that Cato kept with a precision Denton Frick had long ago stopped even pretending to understand. Thomas stood in the doorway for a moment before he spoke. "My father wants you at supper tonight," Thomas said. "At the house." Cato looked up from that ledger. His expression didn't change at all. "Yes, sir," he said. That was it. No questions, no hesitation, not a flicker of surprise. He closed the ledger, set down his pen, and that evening he showed up at the dining room of the main house, exactly when supper was served. Wearing the cleanest clothes he owned, his hands scrubbed clean up to the wrists. He sat at the table. He ate. He spoke when somebody spoke to him. And what he said, according to the one household servant who ever described that evening in any detail, was measured and precise and completely lacking that performative difference that marked almost every interaction between enslaved people and their enslavers back then. He didn't shuffle his feet. He didn't stare at the floor. He answered Harlan Voss's questions about the harvest with the same directness he'd used talking to the overseer, and when Harlan asked him something about the soil makeup of the eastern fields, a question Denton Frick couldn't have answered in a million years, Cato answered it in a way that made Harlan Voss lean back in his chair and just look at him for this long moment before slowly nodding his head. Margaret Voss barely said anything through the whole meal. Thomas watched Cato with this expression that seemed caught somewhere between fascination and unease. Clara kept her eyes fixed on her plate. Little William, who hadn't been told anything unusual was happening, just ate his supper like always and asked to be excused. When the meal ended, Harlan Voss thanked Cato for his work that season and told him he'd get some extra provisions for his household. Cato thanked him back, stood up, and left. The next evening, Cato was at that table again. Nobody had invited him a second time. He just showed up at the same hour in the same clothes and sat down in the same chair. Harlan Voss looked at him when he walked in. And then, and this was the detail the household servant, who saw it, could never quite explain. Even years later, Harlan Voss nodded like this was expected, like it had all been agreed on somehow. And that's how it continued, night after night, through that autumn of 1847, and on into the winter. Cato would appear at Harlan Voss's table. He'd eat with the family. He'd join the conversation when asked and stay quiet when he wasn't. The same household staff that served the Voss family served him too. And those staff members, who were themselves enslaved, who had their own complicated and carefully balanced hierarchies and relationships, never spoke about it. Not to each other, not to the overseer, not to the field hands. The silence around this arrangement was absolute, right from the very beginning. Word reached the neighboring plantations within weeks. It couldn't have been any other way. The Low Country was a small world, and information moved through it as steady and hard to stop as the tide flowing through those salt marshes. Neighbors heard about it. Ministers heard about it. The county sheriff, a man named Aldous Prout, heard about it. And not one of them said a single word to Harlan Voss. This might have been the most disturbing detail of all. Here was a society built entirely on keeping racial lines absolutely clear. A society where a black man sitting at a white man's table wasn't just some social mistake, but a direct challenge to the whole way the world worked in Satan, Helena Parish in 1847, and yet the community stayed silent. It wasn't a natural silence. It wasn't a comfortable silence. It was the silence of people who decided, for reasons they never discussed openly, that whatever was happening out at Grayfield was something they just didn't want to look at too closely. The question nobody asked out loud, the question sitting at the center of everything like a stone at the bottom of some dark river, was pretty simple. What did Cato know? To really understand what Cato knew, you have to understand something about the world he grew up in. He'd arrived at Grayfield as a boy back in 1832, right when the plantation was still finding its feet. Harlan Voss's father, Edmund Voss, was still alive back then, a harder man than his son by most accounts, someone with a much more direct relationship to the violence holding up the whole system he'd built his life around. Edmund Voss had come down from Virginia with money and ambition, and a set of beliefs about how things were supposed to be ordered that he held on to with the certainty of somebody who'd never once had reason to question them. Cato watched Edmund Voss for 3 years before the old man died of a fever in the summer of 1835. He watched how the plantation worked, not just the cotton, not just the fields, but the whole machinery of it. How information moved around, how decisions got made, how power was shared out and maintained and sometimes carefully passed along. He watched Harlan Voss take over that machinery and slowly start making it his own. And from a very young age, he started learning things. Not in any dramatic or secretive way, at least not at first. He learned because learning was just what he did, the way some people breathe or sleep or eat. He learned about the cotton, the soil, the seed, the weather, the timing of everything. He learned the ledgers by watching over the shoulder of the overseer before Denton Frick, a man named Garland who was careless with his books and never noticed the boy sweeping the cotton house floor, paying real close attention to those columns of numbers. He taught himself to read, not from any teacher, not through any formal lessons, but through years of patient, solitary watching that he never once mentioned to anybody. He learned other things too, things harder to put in any simple category. He learned the shape of Harlan Voss's debts. This wasn't hard if you knew where to look and had the patience to really look carefully. The plantation economy back then ran on credit, on loans from Charleston factors, on advances against future harvests, on that whole complicated web of money obligations, tying every planter in the Low Country to every other planter, and to the merchant houses that bankrolled them all. Harlan Voss was no different. He owed money to a factor named Cornelius Hoag, who operated out of a counting house on East Bay Street in Charleston. He owed money to a land agent over in Beaufort. He'd borrowed against the value of several enslaved workers to buy those eastern fields back in 1843, a deal that left him for almost 2 years in a pretty shaky financial position. Cato knew all of this. He'd put it together over the years from fragments, from conversations he overheard, from ledger entries he caught through open doorways, from carefully reading documents that passed through the cotton house, the regular course of business. By 1847, he had a picture of Harlan Voss's finances more complete and more accurate than anything Harlan himself could have pulled together from memory. But that wasn't the most important thing Cato knew. The most important thing had nothing to do with money. It had to do with a man named Reginald Havistock. Reginald Havistock was a planter from Colleton District, the same place Cato had come from before that Charleston auction. He was about Harlan Voss's age, and they'd known each other since they were kids. Their families connected through all those overlapping social networks of the low-country planter class. They weren't close friends exactly. Something between them always kept them from being really close. Some old tension or rivalry neither man ever talked about directly. But they moved in the same circles, attended the same church over in Beaufort, sat on the same county committees. Back in the spring of 1846, Reginald Havistock had come to Grayfield for what he called a social visit. He stayed 3 days. On the second night of that visit, something happened, something that took place in the study of the main house late at night after everyone else had gone to bed. Cato was awake. He was often awake late, working in the cotton house by lamplight on the season's accounts. The cotton house sat close enough to the main house that sound carried on a still night through those open windows. He heard what happened in that study. He didn't tell anyone, not then, not for a long time after. He just filed it away with the same careful precision he filed everything else away, and he waited. Patience in the world Cato lived in wasn't some virtue. It was how you survived. It was the only kind of power somebody in his position could have. The power of knowing when not to act, of holding something back until the moment when it would matter most. By the autumn of 1847, that moment had arrived. If you've been listening close, you already sense that what Cato heard through that open window was something Harlan Voss could never afford to have known. And you're right. But the full shape of it, exactly what passed between those two men in that study and what it meant for everyone at Grayfield, we'll get to that, because to really understand it, you first need to understand what Cato did with what he knew and how he did it and why the whole community of St. Helena Parish decided to just look the other way. And that story is way more complicated than it might seem at first. So if this story is already pulling at you, if you're already wondering what Cato heard through that window and what it cost him to keep it secret, then you know exactly what kind of channel the Fear Sermon is. Drop a like on this video. Leave us a comment with your theory about what you think Cato knew. And subscribe if you haven't already. We'll be right here. Now let's head back to Grayfield in that winter of 1847. By December, the dinner table arrangement had become something the household just absorbed into its daily routines, the same way a body absorbs something foreign that gets stuck in it. Not comfortably, not without paying a price, but with this grim kind of adapting that was maybe more disturbing than open conflict would have been. The household staff served Cato without comment. Thomas Voss ate his supper in silence, just watching. Margaret Voss had gotten in the habit of aiming all her conversation at her husband or her kids, like Cato's presence at the table was just weather, something you put up with instead of acknowledging. Denton Frick, the overseer, said nothing at all. This might have been the most telling silence of all, because Frick wasn't a man naturally inclined toward keeping quiet. He was somebody who shared his opinions freely and often, who had strong ideas about the proper order of things on a plantation, and who wasn't shy about making those ideas known. The fact that he'd looked at what was happening at Grayfield's dinner table and deliberately chosen to say nothing, that meant something. It meant Frick, whatever his other shortcomings, wasn't stupid. He'd looked at the situation and made a calculation, and that calculation told him to keep his mouth shut. What that calculation was based on, Frick never said. But there were people at Grayfield who had their suspicions. Among the enslaved community, reactions to Cato's new position were complicated and layered in ways the white household members never could have fully understood, even if they'd tried. There was definitely some awe. The sheer nerve of what Cato had apparently managed to pull off for himself wasn't lost on anybody who understood the world. They were all trapped in. But there was unease too, and in some quarters something shading into resentment. Cato had always been a figure of authority within the community. The head driver, the man standing between the field hands and the overseer's power. But his authority had always been understood as a form of service, as standing up for the community. What he was doing now felt different. It felt like something he was doing just for himself. There was a woman named Nora who worked in the main house kitchen, who'd been at Grayfield longer than Cato. She'd come with the plantation when Edmund Voss first started it. And in that informal hierarchy of the enslaved community, she had real standing. She was maybe 45 in 1847. A small, compact woman with a way of moving through that kitchen that showed she was always thinking 3 steps ahead of whatever she was doing right then. She'd watched the dinner table arrangement develop from day one, and she'd said nothing to anyone about it. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she was in her own way just as patient as Cato. One evening in January 1848, she found a chance to speak to him alone. It was late. Supper was cleared away, and Cato was crossing the yard between the main house and the cotton house. Nora was at the well drawing water for the next morning's work. "You know what you're doing?" she asked. It wasn't really a question. "I know what I'm doing," Cato said. She asked, "And when it's done, when whatever you're working toward is finished, what happens to the rest of us?" Cato stayed quiet for a minute. The night was cold, the kind of cold that comes off the marsh in January and settles into your bones, and his breath made little clouds in the darkness. "Nothing changes for the rest of you," he said finally. "That's not what this is." Nora looked at him a long time. "You sure about that?" "No," he said. "But it's what I intend." She went back to drawing her water, and he went back to the cotton house, and neither of them ever spoke about it again. What Cato intended, what he'd been working toward, with all that patience and precision that marked everything he did, was something that didn't have a name in the vocabulary of 1848. It wasn't exactly freedom, or at least not just freedom. It was something more specific than that, and more dangerous. He intended to survive Grayfield, not to escape it. Escape meant a whole different kind of calculation, with different risks and different odds. Cato had thought it through carefully and set it aside. The low-country geography wasn't good for escape. You couldn't get through those marshes without a boat, and boats got noticed. The roads heading north were long and dangerous, and a man as tall as Cato, with his appearance, would be remembered everywhere he stopped. The Underground Railroad existed. Cato knew this the same way all enslaved people in the low country knew it, through whispers and coded language and the occasional absence of somebody who'd been there the day before. but it wasn't reliable, and it meant trusting strangers in a way Cato, who'd learned to trust almost nobody, found nearly impossible. No, what Cato intended was different. He meant to make himself so essential to how Greyfield ran, and to Harlan Voss's personal security, that the ordinary machinery of the plantation system couldn't touch him anymore. He meant to build, through years of careful work, a position so unique and so necessary that the question of his status, enslaved or free, property or person, would become practically meaningless. It was an audacious plan. In a lot of ways it was an impossible plan, and it was working. The dinner table wasn't where it started. The dinner table was a result, a visible sign of something that had been growing for years in the ledgers and the cotton house, and the careful management of Harlan Voss's money. Because what Cato had done over nearly a decade was make himself essential, not just to running the plantation, but to its owner's financial survival. He'd done this in ways that didn't stand out individually. He caught mistakes in the factors' accounts. Mistakes that, if they'd gone uncorrected, would have cost Harlan Voss serious money. For 3 years running, he'd picked exactly the right time to harvest, getting the best fiber quality, and therefore the highest prices in Charleston. He managed the workers with a skill that kept productivity up and avoided the kind of disasters, illnesses, injuries, the slow wearing down of morale that could ruin a harvest. He did all this without ever making a big deal of it, without ever acting like anything more than a capable driver doing his job. But Harlan Voss wasn't stupid. He'd noticed. And in the autumn of 1847, when that harvest came in and the numbers were better than they'd been in years, he made his own calculation. That calculation was simple. Cato was worth more to him sitting at that table than out in the field. Not in any sentimental way, not out of gratitude or affection or any of those softer feelings later generations might want to read into these arrangements, looking for something redemptive in a story that didn't have much redemption in it. It was pure practicality. Having Cato at that table, having him in those conversations about how the plantation ran, having his access to the information Harlan needed, was worth more than whatever social cost the arrangement created. And that social cost turned out to be manageable because Harlan Voss had something that made the neighbors and the ministers and the county sheriff think twice about pushing back. He had Reginald Havistock. Back in the spring of 1846, Havistock had come to Greyfield with a proposition. It was about a piece of land, about 200 acres, sitting between Greyfield's eastern edge and the Havistock holdings in Colleton District. The land itself wasn't worth much. It was low and marshy, hard to farm. But it sat in a spot that mattered strategically to both plantations, controlling access to a tidal creek they both used for shipping cotton bales down to the river landing. Havistock wanted to buy it. He'd been trying to buy it for years from the widow who'd originally owned it, a woman named Mrs. Delacroix, who was old and failing and who, for reasons she never explained, kept refusing to sell. When Mrs. Delacroix died in the winter of 1845, the land went to her nephew, a young man named Philip Delacroix, living down in Savannah, who had no real attachment to the low country or its complicated land deals. Havistock approached him right away, but Harlan Voss got there first. He bought that Delacroix parcel in February 1846, 2 weeks before Havistock's agent could even get to Savannah with an offer. The price he paid was fair, not crazy high but fair, and the whole transaction was completely legal. But Havistock took it as a personal insult, and that visit to Greyfield in the spring was supposedly to work out some arrangement where Havistock could still get access to that creek. The negotiation didn't go well. Harlan Voss was polite but firm. The land was his, the creek was his, and he had no interest in sharing either. Haverstock left after 3 days in a mood the household staff at Greyfield described carefully as cold. What happened in that study on the second night of that visit wasn't part of any negotiation. Here's what actually happened. Reginald Haverstock, caught up in a rage that all the whiskey he'd been drinking all evening hadn't exactly helped calm down, said something to Harlan Voss, something specific. Something about a transaction that had taken place several years earlier, a transaction involving the sale of an enslaved person from Haverstock's own place to a buyer down in New Orleans, a transaction recorded in the official papers as a voluntary sale, but that had actually been something much more complicated and much more illegal. The details of what Haverstock said, exactly what that transaction involved and what it meant about his own behavior and the behavior of at least 2 other men in the county, were things Cato heard through that open cotton house window that still spring night in 1846. He heard them clear because Haverstock wasn't exactly whispering, and because the night was warm and they'd opened the study windows to catch whatever breeze came off the marsh. He heard Haverstock threaten Harlan Voss, not with violence. Haverstock wasn't that kind of man, at least not in that moment. He threatened him with exposure. He told Harlan Voss that if they couldn't settle the land thing the way he wanted, he'd make certain information public. Information about Harlan Voss's father Edmund and a series of deals Edmund had made in the years before he died. Deals that involved faking certain legal documents about owning and transferring enslaved people. The faking had been done to hide a debt. Edmund Voss owed a lot of money to somebody in Virginia, and he'd settled that debt through a transaction that under South Carolina law was fraudulent. Reginald Haverstock's father had witnessed that transaction. He'd since died, but he'd left behind a written account of what he saw, an account Reginald now had and was ready to use. If that information ever came out, the legal trouble for Harlan Voss, who'd inherited both the plantation and probably the responsibility for his father's fraud, would be serious. They could seize the land. They could call in the debts. Greyfield itself could be lost completely. Harlan Voss listened to all this without saying a word. And then he said very quietly that he'd think about it. Haverstock left the next morning, and Harlan Voss spent the next months thinking about it, thinking with that focused, methodical attention of a man who knew he was in real danger and didn't have many options. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that somebody else had already heard everything Haverstock said and had been thinking about it too. Cato spent those months between spring 1846 and autumn 1847 doing something that took incredible patience and incredible nerve. Quietly, carefully, systematically, he gathered every piece of information he could find about those deals Edmund Voss had made. The fraudulent ones. The ones Haverstock was threatening to expose. He did it through the ledgers, through the mail that passed through the cotton house, through carefully reading documents. Harlan Voss kept locked in a box in the study, but sometimes brought out to check and left sitting there for a few minutes. By autumn 1847, Cato knew as much about Edmund Voss's fraud as Reginald Haverstock did, maybe more. And he knew something else. Something Haverstock didn't know and Harlan Voss didn't know, and nobody at Greyfield knew except Cato himself. He knew where the original documents were. Not Haverstock's copy, that written account his father left behind. The originals, the actual falsified records Edmund Voss had made and then hidden. Thinking hidden was the same as destroyed. They weren't destroyed. They were in a place Cato had found years earlier, while working in the cotton house, a spot Edmund Voss used for hiding things that his son had apparently never discovered. Cato hadn't touched them. He just noted where they were and waited. In autumn 1847, he went to Harlan Voss. He didn't go with threats. He didn't go with demands. He went with information, specific, precise, carefully organized information about exactly how much legal trouble Harlan Voss was in and what could be done about it. He laid it all out in that quiet, methodical way. He did everything, exactly what he knew and exactly what he was prepared to do with it. And then he made his proposal. It wasn't complicated. In exchange for certain arrangements that included but weren't limited to a seat at that dinner table, Cato would help Harlan Voss deal with the threat Havistock represented. He'd help him find a way to neutralize it using the information and documents Cato had. He'd do this not because he had any loyalty to Harlan Voss or cared whether Greyfield survived, but because it served his own purposes to do so. Harlan Voss listened to all this, and then he did something that surprised even Cato. He laughed. Not a warm laugh, not an amused laugh, a short, sharp sound that had more in common with a cough than real laughter. Then he said, "You've been planning this a long time." "Yes, sir," Cato said. "How long?" Cato thought about it. "Since I was about 15, he said. Harlan Voss looked at him for a long moment, and then he said, "All right."
Just that.
All right. And the arrangement began. That winter of 1848 was cold by low country standards. Not the kind of killing cold you get up north, but a damp, soaking chill that got into that old plantation house and wouldn't leave. The fireplaces in the main rooms burned all the time, and the smell of wood smoke mixing with that salt air off the marsh made an atmosphere that felt suffocating in its own way. Thomas Voss had started drinking. He was 18 by January 1848, old enough to have a clear picture of what was happening at Greyfield, and young enough to find it unbearable. He wasn't a cruel young man. He had his mother's contained quality, that tendency to feel things deep without showing them. But he'd grown up in a world that gave him very specific ideas about how that world was supposed to work, and what was happening at his father's dinner table broke every one of those expectations in ways he couldn't put into words and couldn't ignore. He tried once to talk to his father about it. It was a short conversation. "It's a business arrangement," Harlan Voss said. "You don't need to understand it. I understand enough," Thomas said. His father looked at him with an expression Thomas would remember the rest of his life. Not anger, not contempt, but something almost like pity. "No," Harlan Voss said quietly. "You don't." Thomas never brought it up again. Instead, he started spending his evenings away from the main house, over at the tavern in Beaufort, at neighbors' houses, anywhere that wasn't that Greyfield dining room. His drinking wasn't bad yet, but people noticed, and the ones who noticed understood it as a sign of something nobody wanted to name directly. Clara Voss, 15 by now, developed a different response. She became intensely, almost obsessively watchful. She studied Cato, at that dinner table, with the focused attention of somebody solving a puzzle, cataloging his gestures and his words and his silences with a thoroughness remarkable for a 15-year-old girl in 1848. She started keeping a journal, something her mother encouraged as proper for a young woman of her station. But that journal became much more than a record of social calls and weather notes. It became a document of everything Clara saw and heard at Greyfield, written in handwriting that got more precise and more analytical as the months passed. That journal would eventually give the most detailed account of what happened at Greyfield in the following years. It would be found 60 years later tucked inside the lining of a traveling trunk in a Beaufort attic, found by Clara's granddaughter, who read it with growing disbelief and then, after thinking about it carefully, chose not to share it with anyone outside her immediate family. The journal survived in fragments because Clara's granddaughter couldn't quite bring herself to destroy it. But it didn't become public until much later, and by then the people it described were long dead, and the world they'd lived in was gone, and the story it told felt like something from a dream, vivid and specific and impossible to fully believe. What Clara wrote that winter of 1848 was this: "He watches everything. I don't think Father understands how much he watches. I don't think anyone does except maybe Nora, and Nora doesn't talk about it. He sat at supper tonight and Father asked him about the eastern fields, and he answered in a way that made Father nod. And I thought, he knows more about this plantation than Father does. He knows more about everything here than any of us, and I don't know what he intends to do with that knowledge. But I'm certain. I'm more certain of this than I've been of almost anything. He intends something." She was right, and what he intended was about to become much more visible. In March 1848, Reginald Havistock came back to Greyfield. He hadn't been invited. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon without warning, riding up that long avenue of live oaks to the main house with the air of a man who'd decided patience was over. A lawyer from Beaufort named Gideon Taft came with him, carrying a leather satchel, looking like somebody who'd been told just enough about the situation to be useful, and not quite enough to be comfortable. Harlan Voss received them in the parlor. He was calm. The household staff noticed it afterward, how unusually calm he was, like he'd been expecting this visit and had prepared for it. He offered Havistock a chair and a glass of bourbon and waited. Havistock didn't waste time. He told Harlan Voss he'd decided to go ahead with his threat, that he'd instructed Taft to prepare the documents for filing with the county court. Documents that would start legal proceedings based on the evidence of Edmund Voss's fraud. He said once those proceedings started, they'd be hard to stop, and the consequences for Greyfield would be severe. He said there was still time to avoid all this if Harlan Voss would be reasonable about that land. Harlan Voss listened to all of it. He sipped his bourbon. He looked at Havistock with that same expression, that almost pity he'd shown his son back in January. And then he said, "I'd like you to meet someone." He called for Cato. Cato came into that parlor, not from outside, not from the cotton house, but from the study where he'd apparently been waiting. He carried a leather folder and sat down across from Havistock and Taft with that same unhurried composure he brought to everything. What happened next took about 40 minutes. Cato laid out document by document the complete picture of Edmund Voss's fraud. Not the version Havistock had, the version from his father's written account, but the original records themselves, the actual falsified documents Edmund Voss had hidden in that cotton house and Cato had been holding for years. He spread them out with such precision that Taft, the lawyer, leaned forward in his chair and put on his spectacles and studied them very carefully. And then Cato laid out something else. He laid out documents about Reginald Havistock himself, documents describing in careful detail that transaction Havistock had mentioned to Harlan Voss in the study 2 years earlier, the one selling an enslaved person from Havistock's place to a buyer in New Orleans. The one recorded as voluntary, but was actually something else. What it really was a sale breaking a specific South Carolina law, a law from 1820 that was still technically on the books, even if rarely enforced, prohibiting certain kinds of sales of enslaved people under certain conditions. This wasn't some minor thing. It was the kind of violation that, brought before the right court, could mean serious legal and financial trouble for whoever committed it. Cato had found evidence of this violation the same place. He found everything else, in fragments and ledger entries and conversations overheard that he'd been collecting for years. He hadn't known when he first found it that it would be useful. He just noted it and filed it away, because that's what he did with everything. Haverstock looked at those documents a long time. His face went through several changes during Cato's presentation. Surprise first, then anger, then something not quite fear, but close to it. Taft beside him hadn't said a word. He was looking at Cato with an expression hard to read, something between professional respect and genuine astonishment. "Where did you get these?" Haverstock finally asked. Cato looked at him. "That's not relevant," he said. Haverstock turned to Harlan Voss. "You're going to let him speak to me like that?" Harlan Voss looked at his bourbon glass. "He's speaking the truth," he said. "It's not relevant." The silence after that lasted a long time. Outside, the marsh was quiet the way it gets in early spring, that waiting kind of quiet before the birds come back from the south. A mockingbird called somewhere in those live oaks, and then stopped. Haverstock stood up. He picked up his hat. He looked at Cato one more time, a long look. The kind trying to put something in a category that just wouldn't fit any available category. And then he walked out of that parlor without another word. Taft followed him, clutching his satchel, his face carefully blank. They rode back down that avenue of live oaks and never came back. The legal proceedings never got filed. The land dispute never got resolved in Haverstock's favor. And the story of what happened in that parlor at Grayfield that Tuesday afternoon in March 1848 spread through the low country in that careful, indirect way stories spread in communities where certain things can't be said straight out. Through hints and what people didn't say, through the meaningful silences of people who'd heard something they weren't sure they were supposed to know. What those people understood, without being able to say it exactly, was that something had shifted at Grayfield, something in how things balanced, and that shift had been engineered by a man who, by every legal and social definition in 1848, was still the property of the man he'd just helped. That summer of 1848 was the hottest anybody could remember in St. Helena Parish. The cotton grew fine. It always grew fine in heat, as long as the rain came when it should. But the heat did something to the people at Grayfield that the cotton didn't care about. It wore them down. It made nights long and restless and days feel like something to get through rather than live. The household moved through its routines with a kind of mechanical persistence. And that dinner table kept its strange nightly ritual, and the silence around it kept holding. But something was changing. Thomas Voss came back from Beaufort one July evening with a look on his face his mother recognized right away. The look of somebody who'd heard something and was figuring out what to do with it. He'd heard a version at the tavern of what happened with Haverstock back in March. The version he got was incomplete and twisted, like those stories always are by the time they've gone through enough mouths. But the core of it was clear enough. He heard his father had used an enslaved man to threaten a neighbor. He heard that enslaved man had produced documents. He heard Haverstock had left without a word. He came home and went straight to his father's study. The conversation that followed was the longest and most important Harlan Voss and his son ever had. It went most of the night. Clara, whose room was next to the study, heard pieces through the wall. Not enough to put the whole thing together, but enough to understand the shape of it. She wrote in her journal the next morning, in that careful, precise handwriting she'd developed. "Feather told Thomas something last night I couldn't fully hear. Thomas's voice was loud at first and then got quiet, which is always scarier than loud. Near the end I heard him say, 'And what happens when he decides he wants more?' And I heard Father say, 'He won't.' And Thomas said, 'How do you know?' And Father was quiet a long time. Then he said something I couldn't make out. Then Thomas left. I heard him go down the stairs and out the front door. He didn't come back until morning. Thomas's question, what happens when he decides he wants more, was the question everyone at Greyfield had been not asking for almost a year. It lived in the silence around that dinner table, in Denton Frick's careful avoidance, in Nora's watchful eyes from the kitchen. It was the question the story kept circling, kept approaching, kept pulling back from. The real answer, the one Harlan Voss gave his son in that study that night, was something Clara didn't hear, but it became clear over the following months through what happened next. Quietly, without any announcement, Harlan Voss started the process of manumitting Cato. Manumission, legally freeing an enslaved person, wasn't impossible in South Carolina in 1848, but it wasn't easy either. The state had been steadily tightening the rules since the early part of the century, and by the 1840s you had to petition the state legislature, show exceptional circumstances, and get approval from a committee that wasn't exactly friendly to these requests. It could take years and fail at any point, and with political tensions over slavery building toward what would become the crisis of the 1850s, it was especially tricky. Harlan Voss started the process anyway. He used a lawyer in Charleston, not Taft, who was Havistock's man, but a different lawyer named Cornelius Pringle, who had a reputation for handling sensitive matters discreetly. The petition got filed quietly, without any fuss, and had been working through channels for months before anybody at Greyfield even knew it existed. Cato knew. He'd known almost from the beginning. Pringle sent a letter to Greyfield that passed through the Cotton House, and Cato read it before sending it on to the main house, same as he read everything passing through that Cotton House. He read it and said nothing, and kept coming to that dinner table every night, and kept running the plantation's affairs with that same quiet competence he always had. But something in him shifted after reading that letter. Something Clara noticed, even if she couldn't say exactly what. A quality of attention that changed slightly. A sense that the waiting that had defined him so long was entering its final phase. The petition got approved in the spring of 1849, not because that committee had any sympathy for manumission as a principle. They didn't, but because Harlan Voss made a case that was, in its own way, as carefully constructed as everything else at Greyfield the past 2 years. He argued that Cato's services to the plantation were the kind that couldn't be properly compensated within the existing legal framework, and that the current arrangement, the dinner table, the management role, the access to the plantation's finances, was creating legal ambiguities that could cause problems. He argued, basically, that manumission was the cleanest solution to a messy situation. The committee accepted that argument with reservations, and the papers got signed. On a morning in April 1849, Cato was legally free. He was 29 years old. He'd been enslaved about 17 years. He'd spent the last decade of those years building, with patience and precision that defied easy description, the conditions of his own freedom. He didn't leave Greyfield right away. This was the detail people found hardest to understand in the years after. The fact that he stayed. He stayed another 6 months through summer and into fall, still running the plantation's affairs, still showing up at that dinner table, still in every visible way exactly what he'd always been. The difference was he got paid now. Not much. The arrangement wasn't generous, but actual money, a wage recorded in the plantation ledgers that Cato kept in a small tin box in the Cotton House. In October 1849, he left. He didn't make any announcement. Didn't have any farewell conversation with Harlan Voss, or if he did, no record survived. He just packed what little he owned and walked down that avenue of live oaks and never came back. What happened to Cato after Greyfield is mostly lost. There's a man named Cato appearing in records of Charleston's free black community in the early 1850s, working as a factor's agent, handling accounts and correspondence for some of the smaller trading houses along the waterfront. The records describe him as tall, precise in his manner, and exceptionally good with numbers. Whether this is the same man, impossible to say for sure. The records don't give a last name, and the description, while consistent, isn't definite. There's also a reference in a letter Cornelius Pringle wrote to a colleague in 1853 about a former client of unusual ability who'd established himself in Charleston's commercial life, and who, in Pringle's opinion, had a clearer understanding of how this city's financial systems worked than most men who'd spent their whole lives inside them. Pringle doesn't name the man, but the timing and description are suggestive. Beyond these scraps, the trail goes cold. Greyfield itself lasted another 15 years until the Civil War made the low country plantation economy impossible to sustain. Harlan Voss died in 1857 of a heart condition his doctor blamed on the accumulated stress of running a big agricultural operation during increasingly unstable political times. Thomas Voss tried to keep the plantation going after his father died, but he didn't have the temperament or the knowledge that for years had lived mainly in the man who sat at that dinner table and was now gone. By 1861, Greyfield was struggling. By 1865, it was finished. Margaret Voss lived until 1871. Clara married a man from Beaufort in 1855 and moved to his family's property, where she kept her journal until the end of her life. That journal passed to her daughter, then to her granddaughter, then into the lining of that traveling trunk in that attic where it waited 60 years. Denton Frick left Greyfield in 1850, the year after Cato left, and took an overseer job on a Georgia plantation. He never spoke publicly about what he'd witnessed at Greyfield. In a letter to his brother written sometime in the early 1850s and preserved in a family collection in Savannah, he wrote, "I've seen things in this work I wouldn't have believed possible, and the strangest of them was at a place in Beaufort district where a man did something I still can't fully account for. I won't write it down, but I think about it." Nora stayed at Greyfield to the end. The Emancipation Proclamation freed her in 1863, and she stayed on the property several more years, working for wages in the household of the family that bought what remained of the plantation from Thomas Voss's creditors. She died in 1871, same year as Margaret Voss, and got buried in that small cemetery at the property's edge where Greyfield's enslaved community had buried its dead for 30 years. Nobody recorded what she thought about any of it. She kept her own counsel, same as always. The county courthouse records that might have given a clearer picture, the manumission petition, the Havistock dispute, all those financial transactions Cato navigated were destroyed in an 1879 fire. Officially, a lamp left burning overnight in the records room. Several people alive at the time had private doubts about that explanation, but nobody investigated and the matter was closed. What remained after everything was Thomas Voss's question from that hot July night in 1848. Heard through the study wall while Clara listened. What happens when he decides he wants more? Harlan Voss's answer, the one Clara couldn't hear, was never recorded. But what followed suggested what it might have been. Because what Cato wanted from the beginning wasn't more. He wanted exactly what he'd planned for since age 15, with a patience and precision the world he lived in gave him no choice but to develop. He wanted out, not revenge. Not power over the people who'd held power over him. Not the satisfaction of watching Greyfield fail, though it did fail eventually, like all such things do. Just out, free, gone. That dinner table, that strange, sinister, inexplicable arrangement that scandalized the neighbors and silenced the ministers and left Denton Frick writing cryptic letters to his brother decades later. Had been the price of that freedom. A calculated price, paid in patience and knowledge, and the careful management of other people's secrets. A price Cato decided years before anyone else understood what was happening was the one he was willing to pay. Whether it was worth it, whether any of it was worth it, whether those years of waiting and watching and holding his knowledge like a stone in his chest were worth the freedom at the end, that's a question the record doesn't answer. Can't answer. The record's too incomplete. The silence is too deep. The man himself too carefully absent from the documents that survived. But there's one more thing. One detail Clara recorded in her journal the morning after Cato left Greyfield in October 1849. She watched him go from her window, watched him walk down that avenue of live oaks in early morning light, carrying a small bundle, not looking back. She wrote, "He didn't look back. Not once. I watched until he was out of sight, and he never turned." I've been trying to decide what that means, and I think I've decided. It means he already said goodbye to this place a long time ago. He was just waiting for his body to catch up. She closed her journal, didn't write in it again for 3 days. And somewhere down that avenue of live oaks, in the early morning light of an October day in 1849, a man who'd spent 17 years building the conditions of his own freedom walked away from the place that held him and didn't look back and was gone. So what do you think of this story? Do you believe everything got revealed, or do you think there are layers here the record deliberately or otherwise chose not to keep? Drop your thoughts in the comments. The story of Cato and Greyfield is one history swallowed almost whole, and the fragments left raise more questions than they answer. If you want more stories like this, stories living in that space between what we know and what we can only guess at, subscribe to the Fear Sermon. Hit that notification bell and share this video with someone who loves the kind of mystery that doesn't need anything supernatural to be deeply, truly unsettling. We'll see you in the next one.